We begin today's program with U.S. President Donald Trump's latest travel ban from October the 18th. Citizens of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea or North Korea will be banned from entering the U.S. The ban follows Trump and Kim Jong-un lobbing rounds of wild and bitter insults at each other, forcing the entire world to hold their breath. Before our discussion about what exactly is happening, take a look at this.
Another bruise on the U.S. DPRK relation. U.S. President Donald Trump has slapped travel restrictions on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Venezuela, and Chad, among 5 other countries. Things have spiraled out of control in recent years with rounds of nuclear and ballistic missile tests by the DPRK, further testing the patience of the U.S. ROK alliance. While Trump promised to shoot fire and fury, Kim Jong-un fired back with his latest verbal warning written in the first person.
As Trump, to the world's face, rejected the existence of me and country and made the most vicious declaration of war, we will seriously consider executing a fitting, most serious, retaliatory contingency plan.
It followed Trump's speech at the UN this week where he mocked Kim as a rocket man on a suicide mission and publicly criticized the DPRK government for denying the human rights for its own people, violating international law, and jeopardizing the peace and harmony for the humankind.
We will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
The brutal North Korean regime does not respect its own citizens or the sovereignty of other nations. Our new executive order will cut off sources of revenue that fund North Korea's efforts to develop the deadliest weapons known to humankind.
While the war of words is fuming with nitrate and sulfur, the world is alarmed this decades-long fray may soon erupt. How the ramifications of this new travel restriction will pan out remains to be seen. But it is never safe to test the resolve of the DPRK.
So, how are we going to make sense of all the latest development? Let's talk to our panelist from Beijing, Zhao Tong, associate at Carnegie's Nuclear Policy Program, based at the Carnegie Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Welcome to our program. In Medford, we invited Sung-Yoon Lee, a Kim Koo-Korea Foundation professor of Korean Studies at Fletcher School at Tufts University. Welcome, Professor. Also joining us, we're honored to have in Los Angeles Jonathan Pollack, Senior Fellow with the Center for East Asia Policy at the Brookings Institution. Welcome to you as well. Shall I ask you first, Mr. Pollack, what should we make of the mixed messages coming out of the administration? President Trump saying certain things in the tweets, Secretary of State saying other things, and Secretary of Defense have also a different version. What exactly is the real essence you're reading, Mr. Pollack?
Well, I think let's look at President Trump first. He tweets all the time. It's really regrettable. I don't think it helps at any level, and it harms at many, many levels. This is playing to his domestic political base that expects him to do this. What President Trump seems not to understand, or doesn't really seem to care much about, is that there is a big difference between whatever he chooses to say domestically and the messages he sends internationally, in particular to North Korea. So ironically, his words, which are obviously very, very anti-North Korea, very hostile towards North Korea, and actually serves North Korea's purposes because it validates their whole internal arguments about unremitting U.S. hostility and so forth. But I see it as serving no useful purpose whatsoever, and potentially, depending on circumstances, could be something much worse, given the higher levels of military interaction between the two sides.
Well, Mr. Pollack, you understand that Mr. Trump had been giving out some of those tweets, as you mentioned, talking about Little Rock Man, adding a little there, and also he's been talking about it won't last long, won't be around much longer. That is the exact quote. Of course, that sounds like a determination to terminate somebody or some countries. So how should we understand that? People in this part of the world are watching very consciously.
I understand. I don't want to discount what President Trump says, but he says many things. And the fact that he says many things diminishes the credibility of any one thing that he says. So I think it's very important to pay heed to the things that he says, but I would look much more at the larger context, the the possible risks of military conflict and not be too much focusing on things that he says today or says tomorrow, because he can change his views and statements all the time.
But of course, he is the president of the United States. Professor Lee,
but he is president. Yeah, I do understand that he is president of the United States. I don't discount that at all.
Okay, Professor Lee, you've been doing a lot of research about South Korea, and at this point, South Korean parliamentary members have been suggesting that the DPRK, North Korea, have been moving its planes toward the east coast. At this point, Mr. Lee, we cannot verify any of those information. Having said that, though, what do you make of this, rhetorics and reaction to rhetorics, and now it seems to be in the military means even? Professor Lee, are we getting there, ever danger of having a possible conflict?
Well, the show of force by the U.S. Air Force over the weekend, flying bombers and warplanes inside North Korean airspace on the East Coast, was aggressive. It is a mini escalation, and that probably will trigger another show of force in response by North Korea. The North Korean foreign minister, in very brief remarks yesterday in New York, achieved many things. He spoke in a measured tone and basically said North Korea is acting in self-defense, and the specificity of the threat, the claim that North Korea has the right to shoot down U.S. planes even outside North Korean airspace, it set the stage for the next North Korean provocation, probably more a conventional, in quotation marks, provocation like a missile test or a nuclear test. After that, much of the world will let out a sigh of relief that North Korea did not shoot down a U.S. plane, which would entail the loss of lives and may trigger a military response. So it was really a freebie that President Trump gave North Korea. His bellicose language works only for North Korea. It brings no benefit to the United States. It's a fodder for North Korea, an excuse for another provocation in self-defense.
Mr. Zhao, here in Beijing, one of the things that I guess leaders from all over the world needs to understand, that there is nothing that they are saying domestically that wouldn't spread internationally. We are in the internet age, right? That is just so clear. So what do you make of this rhetorical war, while at the same time some show of force from the United States flying its bombers inside the airspace of North Korea without the other side notice, and now North Korea reacting in words also, Mr. Zhao?
I think it's very important to make that connection between domestic and international rhetorics. The movement by North Korea, mobilization of their reported mobilization of their aircrafts to the east of the country, could be intended to send a signal that they are serious about preparing to shoot down the U.S. bombers, which overflew the eastern part of North Korean airspace, according to the news reports. However, if we look at the real North Korean military capabilities, their aircrafts were so outdated, they probably don't have the capability to really shoot down the semi-stealth American bombers, let alone the fighter jets. And North Korean air defense systems are even further away from being able to engage with American aircrafts.
So what is your point here?
The point is, it's more likely simply to sound, not backing down. North Korea is tough. But also, if we actually follow North Korean domestic rhetorics, if we look at North Korean domestic propaganda in recent days, there are multiple references to the call for North Korean people to shift their anger towards the United States to achieve their economic development goals. So it's using the anger to achieve economic goals. So it's very obvious that North Korea is not deliberately provoking a war. It wants to maintain status quo, wants to focus on economic development. The game that is played between North Korea and the United States is both countries do not mind appearing that the risk of war is very serious. They are playing a game of brinksmanship, a game of risk-taking. No country wants to fall over the cliff, but the game itself, the game of risk-taking itself is very dangerous.
It is dangerous, and there's a Chinese phrase even for that, to play with fire. I guess both are playing with fire. Mr. Pollack, you're very familiar with that phrase. There were earlier versions of playing with fire, but never to this extent, at least in words. So, there are other countries in the region, Japan, South Korea, China. All these countries might be severely impacted as a result of play with words eventually comes to play with action. So, Mr. Pollack, anything that the other countries can do at this point?
Well, it's interesting that China and South Korea and I suppose in a different way Japan have all become, I don't want to call them bystanders, but you are seeing this intense focus on the U.S.-North Korea aspect, which very frankly is the way the North Koreans would wish it. But I think that what the other countries have to do, and they can do this either individually or collectively, is to impart their clear concerns about a needless escalation at a verbal level, and also a concern, an increased concern about some possibility of a military clash of some form. There is history, of course. North Korea shot down U.S. aircraft in early 1969 and 31 American servicemen died, but that's a long time ago, and U.S. capabilities, as Professor Tong just noted, are far superior to whatever North Korea has. So there's at least an equal risk that if one of the North Korean aircraft were to challenge an American bomber or fighter aircraft, that they might also be shot down.
Well, you know,
so here again, I think that the most important... Yeah, please.
Go ahead, sir. Please complete.
Yeah. I was going to say that the real problem here, or the real risk, is that all of this is occurring in a domain, a geographic domain, that affects the interests of every other country very, very keenly. And no one wants to see a war, but we could see a situation of either inadvertent conflict, accidental conflict, that somehow then escalates it further. I would agree with both of my colleagues that we need to look at the domestic angles as North Korea interprets them. I doubt in any real sense that North Korea feels that they are ready for a war, but we have to accept the fact that the risks have demonstrably increased. The question is how severe are the risks and whether or not anyone else can influence what the two countries do.
You know what, Mr. Pollack, I think some people would say you are exactly falling into the trap that the others want you to fall into, which is to lead further and ever closer to any possibility of military encounter between those two countries and probably have an impact on the others. Mr. Zhao here in Beijing, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson has said very clearly, Lu Kang, he said, both sides, North Korea, United States, please exercise a sufficient amount of sophistication about the judgment, what exactly is happening right here. Mr. Zhao, what exactly is happening? Is it going to be just rhetoric wars? Or actually, we are seeing real dangers? And how can China, together with the others, try to calm both parties down? After all, there's a sanction going on. That's supposed to be the stick. And where is the carrot?
Well, so far, both North Korea and the United States want to maintain a war of words, but the risk is the confrontation can run out of control. Incidents can happen, so it can become a real military hot war. China, I think, is growingly concerned about this becoming real. So we see China recently stepped up its economic sanctions against North Korea. The Ministry of Commerce released a new regulation that imposes new restrictions on oil supply to North Korea, on textile import from North Korea, etc. Those are meant to send a very strong signal to North Korea to further restrain itself. China is also working more closely with the United States, increasingly a sign that the Chinese military is willing to talk with the American military about crisis management or how to coordinate in case of instability situation in North Korea.
Any apparent crisis could be used as a window of opportunity. We all understand in international politics, but the question is whether all sides, particularly some, are smart enough to catch those opportunities. Professor Lee, what would you say?
I have a question for you, Ms. Tian.
Go ahead.
What
Professor.
is the bigger provocation in your view? What would you think is the bigger provocation? A hydrogen bomb test over the Pacific or the specific act of shooting down a U.S. plane and killing perhaps 12 or 24 American servicemen? What would the U.S. see as the bigger provocation necessitating a military response? In my view, it's the latter. It's the loss of lives, which would really paint President Trump into a corner in the wake of all this bluster threats that he has made. That would more likely trigger a military response, killing Americans, rather than the very serious hydrogen bomb test over the ocean. So in a way, Trump has paved the road for North Korea for the next provocation. And even if North Korea were to do something like that, which would have grave health radiation implications, I don't think the world community would support a military response by the United States. Even a hydrogen bomb test in the Earth's atmosphere would not be considered as a casus belli. Therefore, North Korea has won this round of bout. With the war of words, North Korea is now poised to really escalate in a major way and get away with it.
But you know, Professor Lee, there's another thing. People are wondering, especially from this part of the world, whether that is exactly what Washington wants. That Washington wants to create certain kind of fearful situation in this region and have to kidnap everybody into that situation. And of course, in this sense, North Korea was also playing a very crucial part of it. Professor Lee, what would you say about that?
I don't think the U.S. wants to go there, but it's sort of stumbling into that eventuality closer and closer. A war in the Korean Peninsula would mean the loss of probably tens of thousands of American lives, soldiers and maybe U.S. citizens, residents in South Korea and Japan. It would be politically a self-defeating proposition for the Trump administration. I don't think sound-minded folks in the administration want to go there.
Right.
But President Trump, by making all these inane remarks, is, letting North Korea get away with things and bringing his country closer to that kind of critical point.
Mr. Pollack, what are we doing here? I mean, on the one hand, all countries at the UN Security Council working so hard, come up with these terms in order to have sanctions against the DPRK, and eventually had an agreement. Everybody say we're implementing, including China and also some of the other countries. And now, on the other hand, we are wasting our time playing with these rhetorical games, not necessarily catching the opportunity. What are we doing here, Mr. Pollack?
Well, I think you've already identified that that President Trump's comments, inane was the word that was used a few moments ago, have served North Korean purposes. President Trump may believe somehow that he can put North Korea under such extraordinary stress that it breaks, its will breaks. I doubt that that's going to happen. The more important story here, very frankly, is the ratcheting up of the sanctions. The fact that there is collective agreement on this, that China has undertaken steps that are really quite unprecedented, signaling some of them.
Mr. Pollack, it is not just rhetoric coming from the U.S. president. It's actually actions, because there are U.S. bombers that are flying into the area of North Korea. And as a result of that, North Korea, through its foreign minister, was saying certain things at the United Nations. So it is not just the president. Please just do not blame one person. There are a lot of things going on at the same time.
Right. No. I take your point. Look, it is true that, I mean, the United States has undertaken these kinds of bombing runs for many, many years, but they have moved them closer or into North Korea's immediate airspace, which is inherently risky. I understand that. I think that having made that signal the United States should cool down a bit. There's no question that the United States has the capacity, the military capacity, to put North Korea under direct pressure. But I guess you asked an appropriate question. What's the end game here? What is the presumption of what the outcome is that people are looking for? And in this context, I would not at all trivialize the impact if North Korea were to undertake a major nuclear test over the Pacific. This is something that's almost unprecedented in the sense that no countries have been engaged in that kind of behavior. And indeed, even North Korea, for all of its offenses and all of its violations of international order, has not undertaken an atmospheric test, one that would endanger the health and well-being of many citizens in the Pacific.
Mr. Zhao.
Well, I think...
alongside, I heard from your side, Mr. Zhao.
Yes, I think every major player is simply reacting to new developments. I don't think anyone has a good long-term strategy to fundamentally resolve the crisis. So the real risk is we can blunt walk into a real crisis. The U.S. logic and the North Korean logic are completely opposite. U.S. still believe that putting more coercive pressure will make North Korea back down. North Korea believes that it needs to better demonstrate its capability. It needs to send a strong signal. It needs tougher actions to make the United States recognize its nuclear capabilities. So they are simply talking and working across each other. The real risk is no one is really stop, pause, and take a deep breath and reflect upon their history and think, what's the right lesson to learn?
I see. That's why you have alongside right before you answer that question. Take a deep breath. And Professor Lee, what about you? Are you going to take that deep breath and help us understand the latest situation, your version, Professor?
I think there is a silver lining in all this.
Really?
Now that we are comparing Mr. Trump to Mr. Kim, well, now that we're so focused on the war of words, we tend to be dismissive of bluster coming out of North Korea. I mean, North Korea has called former U.S. President George W. Bush human scum, political idiot. It's called Obama a wicked black monkey that should go back to its natural habitat in Africa and feed off the breadcrumbs thrown at it by tourists. It's called the female South Korean President, Park Geun-hye, a dirty old prostitute.
There, so.
Now, we don't take that as a serious indication. We don't take that as a serious indication that North Korea is about to strike. So if we apply that model to Mr. Trump, maybe he's just making silly comments without real intention or knowledge of the situation and is unlikely to take military action. That's what I'm hoping for.
That's what you're hoping for. At this point, all sides are watching very closely. Mr. Zhao, of course, China once again trying to calm everybody down while at the same time implement sanctions. That's certainly likely to be negative for China's North Korea relations. North Korea have very few allies. China is one of those countries that used to work with North Korea at different historical stages. So I always ask you that question. The most difficult question is, what options does China have in hand at this point, Mr. Zhao? What about now?
Well, I think China will try to keep the pressure on North Korea, while at the same time, through diplomatic channels, persuading the United States to think twice about its current approach. We already see the results of Mr. Trump's harsh rhetoric at the UN General Assembly. That was only met with even harsher rhetorics from North Korea. So hopefully the two countries can recognize that their current path they are taking is only leading them to a direct confrontation.
I would love to take that as a satisfying answer, but I have to mention, Mr. Zhao, there are more political events to come. For example, China has a party congress. You also have a United States president likely to visit China later in November. All of these things, timelines, could be very crucial time. Very briefly from you, Mr. Zhao.
Right, the risk of North Korea exploiting this opportunity is
and the
increasing.
other parties too.
Right, so there is important Chinese domestic events coming up, and the risk is North Korea could take this time to conduct additional provocations, believing that China wouldn't have the ability to focus its resources in pressuring North Korea. So that further demonstrates the necessity for China and the United States to better coordinate to avoid North Korea taking advantage of this very important time.
I see. Zhao Tong, Sung-Yoon Lee, Jonathan Pollack, thank you so much, gentlemen, once again, for your analysis. Really appreciate it.